welcome to Calling All Systems. My name is Brian Watson. I'm an assistant professor of systems engineering at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, and I'll be your host today for this episode focusing on resilience, presented by Dassault. As we start talking about resilience, I want to start by pulling up a current event. Some of you may be aware that there's been significant flooding in Brazil over the last few weeks. It's resulted in over 150 deaths, 1.4 million people impacted, over 1 million people without running water. And at this point, repairs are expected to cost over $10 billion. A recent news article by Camilla Gasilli says, the floods that devastated the southern region of the country in recent days cannot be considered isolated incidents. In other words, unfortunately, we cannot prevent them from happening, but we can and must make our cities more resilient to these situations. So we've gathered together today an exciting panel to talk about resilience, what it is, and how as system engineers we can think about it and work with it. And I'm excited to introduce our panelists to you now at this point in alphabetical order. We're starting with Michael Berkowitz. He's the Executive Director at the University of Miami's Climate Resilience Academy and the Eric T. Levin Endowed Chair in Climate Resilience. His previous roles include founding principal at the Resilient Cities Catalyst, 100 Resilient Cities President, Global Head of Operation Risk Management at Deutsche Bank, and Deputy Commissioner at the Office of Emergency Management in New York City from 1998 to 2005. Next, we have Brian Han. He's the Director of Model-Based System Engineering and Simulation Process Data Management Process Consulting at Dassault Systems. Beginning in the early 2000s, Brian's career focused on understanding the interplay of system reliability and system security requirements for particular systems. His specialization is modeling and simulation to develop requirements that address how missions, systems, and organizations can withstand, adapt, and recover from adversarial disruptions or attacks. And finally, we have Dr. David Woods, the Chief Scientist at Adaptive Capacity Labs and Professor Emeritus in the Department of Integrated System Engineering at The Ohio State University. Dr. Woods is a preeminent scholar on resilience engineering. He's authored several books, including Resilience Engineering. His work's been cited over 44,000 times, and he recently started the Snafu Catchers Consortium to build resilience in critical digital services, and he served as past president of the Resilience Engineering Society. Gentlemen, so welcome to Calling All Systems. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
So, as we get started with our questions today, I want to invite our live audience. Please put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll incorporate them into the discussion as we proceed through the topics. So I want to start today by talking about the current interest in resilience. So I went to Google Trends this week, and I searched the word resilience, and they start keeping a record back in 2004. And since 2004 to now, this is the most interest the public has shown in resilience in terms of Google searches. Right? It's actually a pretty linear with some noise slope from low of 2004 up to pretty high now. And so my question is, why do you think that interest is, and have you seen this in your own careers, the interest in resilience? We'll start with anyone who's ready.
Well, it started for me around 2000. While there had been some use of the word resilience before, it was still a very unusual word to use in dealing with complexity and disasters and safety. And so it represented for many of us, including some of the earlier trends, a new framing, a new orientation. Rather than simply trying to prevent, the issue was we needed to have a more active stance. And this applied whether we were dealing with industrial disasters, patient safety in healthcare, and reducing adverse events to patients, natural disasters. The big thing that kicked it off, I think, was Hurricane Katrina, frankly. And in 2007, there was a major government report. Steve Flynn was one of the lead authors, who's now at Northeastern running a resilience institute. And that became, I think, a major impetus for the growth of the label resilience. And that all of a sudden it became a critical societal need to understand and build more resilient systems at all scales.
Yeah, I think my journey follows a little bit behind David's, in that I first started working in my bio, we talked about the interplay of security and reliability, and that's not yet resilience there, but I started working on that problem in the 2005, 6, 7 time frame or so. It was around 2009 or 10 that we began to realize that because we were oftentimes worrying about in the systems I was working on, illegitimate actors, so people that are trying to get in either damage the system or to exploit the system for their own gain, in some unauthorized way. Was the realization, well, they learn, just as much as anyone does. The saying started kind of floating around a little bit of, well, in time, the man always beats the machine. And so so then we kind of needed to find some way. It's like, okay, well, how do we recognize that we're really moving outside of security design and reliability engineering into something that is far more adaptive? It evolves, kind of like what David was just talking about before, of how it's not just a matter of you can't just bake it in, but you have to recognize you have to have systems in place to allow to essentially change the system that you're trying to protect, or even obsolete it and move on to the next one and understand what that life cycle really is. So I think the idea of adversarial resiliency started entering into my lexicon kind of in the 2010, 2011 timeframe.
I think, I was at Deutsche between 2005 and 2013. And so we were using that. I was the head of operational risk, and we were using that to think about recovery versus resilience. When systems failed, technology systems is mostly, and business processes as well, did they fail over and need to be recovered, or could they transfer those processes somewhere more resiliently? So that's kind of where we started to use it. But this concept of urban resilience or community resilience, how cities and communities survive and thrive in the face of disasters like the one you described in southern Brazil, that really comes in part from the Rockefeller Foundation, who was involved in Katrina and in the response to Katrina as a philanthropic organization in 2005, and then Superstorm Sandy in 2012. And in 2013, as you mentioned, they started something called 100 Resilient Cities. And that was an effort to try to change the way cities plan and acted, to make them more integrated and inclusive and forward-looking and risk-aware. The idea there was that approach would reduce fragility and increase resilience. And as part of that, we really actively promoted this term, urban resilience. We were using the 100 cities, of which actually Porto Alegre, one of the most impacted cities in southern Brazil, was a member. We were trying to get other cities to adopt the methods of the 100. And so we spent a lot of time trying to influence, and and money, and that may explain at least some of this interest in resilience, at least the urban resilience, disaster resilience, climate resilience side of things.
So I think what everybody's saying, Brian, is that part of this was a real reframing, a real shift from building up reactive response capabilities to proactive investments, looking ahead and saying, how do I build different kinds of adaptive capacity, right? And that's the key word that underlies a shift here. Sure. It's not the same as the usual preparation, response, and recovery for disaster response that's been around for at least 40 years. Right. We traced it all the way back to the 17th century in Portugal, by the way, to the Marquis de Pombal was the first systems engineer for safety in the aftermath of a major earthquake and tsunami, right. Where you could just redesign the environment. And you see that in Lisbon if you visit today. You'll see the broad boulevards, which are fire breaks. And you'll see the porcelain tiles all over the sides of houses, which are fire prevention. And so the architecture and style of the city represents what Michael was talking about, 300 years ago. So we can do this if we think proactively and reinforce sources of adaptive capacity and give them avenues by which they can tailor their capabilities to the particular challenges in a particular crisis when it arises.
I think what's interesting, David, is that this re-architecting takes time, and it's like at least in the urban context, it's a generational struggle in some ways to get to places where you can both deal with floodwaters, you can reduce fragility through more inclusive and equitable economic development, you can enhance governance systems that get people to the table so they don't feel left out or marginalized during disaster. Like that is going to take some time. And so that's going to be a little bit of the dissonance. You see it a lot in the coverage of the southern Brazil flooding, where it's like, why didn't things work better? And what can we do today in order to improve it for tomorrow? And there may be low-hanging fruit and quick wins, but I also kind of think, what you're describing in Lisbon took time, and it will take time in our cities in order to re-architect them in ways that are appropriate for the 21st century.
And the Marquis de Pombal was also confronted by political and social trends that they had a different set of levers, since he was a marquis after all. But Michael, you bring up, I think, another really critical point here, which is about different time horizons, right? That fundamentally, once we start shifting to exploring what makes systems more resilient in the face of challenge and change, we have to start thinking longer term ahead. We have to have a future oriented. In biology, this is the confidence biology has that no matter how good you've been, no matter how adaptive, how fit you are to your environment over time, up till right now, that the future will produce challenges, not just to your fitness, but because of your fitness. As you succeed, you change the environment and you change the kinds of surprises that happen. Now, this is what Brian has experienced in cybersecurity. We develop connectivity, and then others hijack the connectivity for their advantage. And all of a sudden, ransomware becomes the cybersecurity threat of the year, which I think is now extended into a decade of ransomware still being a major threat that we have some struggles, perhaps, Brian, to still cope with completely.
Yeah, no, it's and I also kind of want to draw out that, like, the resilience part, and oftentimes I get lumped into cybersecurity because, of course, I work with them very closely, but I'm not a cybersecurity expert, by any means. It's more of a it's kind of like, okay, how do I pull in this idea of how am I going to be resilient to an illegitimate actor? Well, recognize they learn, which means I need to start modeling how it is that I think they're going to learn from my system. So when they attack my system, or when they poke at it, or even smell it, or something along those lines, what does my system teach them? And then, because they've been taught something, where are they going to come back again as essentially their counter? So we even start getting into points now, depending upon the kinds of criticalities of the systems and the kinds of actors, where we have our system actually kind of bluff or kind of try to give different kinds of signals, or to try to remain as silent as it can, in these kinds of responses. In the meantime, we need to be essentially, the systems need to have, I'll say, like an extra layer of monitoring kind of going on in them to understand how they're being poked, so that then you can go off into, and this is where you're really moving away from, let's say, the traditional reliability engineering, security engineering. And I see there's a question that's kind of poking around, how is this a little different? Well, where before, and I started my career as a reliability engineer, I would okay, I need to have things that are robust. I need to have redundancy. I need to have, different, sparing techniques, things along those lines, to get the maintainability up. Well, now it's going to be more of a, I don't necessarily know what I'm going to need in the future, but I got to be prepared for it. It's getting the right balance of structure and chaos, if you will, in the design, which actually allows me to then, as things happen in the outside world, as I discover and as others discover how they can use my system, perhaps in ways I don't want them to use, that I can essentially make the changes and continue to adapt and evolve. So it's kind of exciting, because I'll say that much of the modeling that I would be doing, as a systems engineer, when my responsibility is to protect against the adversary, is I actually model the adversary, and the adversary actually drives the majority of my system requirements, which was kind of a change in the paradigm, right? So instead of thinking of, this is the function that I need, it's going to be more of a, this is the function that I need up to this level, given these are going to be the things that are going to be happening around me.
So these bring up the some of the fundamentals behind the label resilience. And one of these is that there's some basic trade-offs, not just one, but a series of basic trade-offs that underlie everything. And the comments about changing patterns of natural threats and the scale, right, and the future orientedness of things highlights how there's a trade-off, a conflict between what do I need now? Because I'm under pressure now. I have finite resources now. I have pressure from various stakeholders about what are their priorities. But I also have to take a future-oriented look, as Michael and Brian just described. And that costs, that takes resources. It takes attention, it takes expertise. And often organizations under pressure say, well, but that's not me. Much of the empirical research is how focuses on how organizations and management often discount the evidence that the change is happening. New forms of challenge can arise, often because they rely on a past record of success. Hey, I'm more reliable than I've ever been. I'm better, I'm more productive than I've ever been. What do you mean I have to invest in managing future risks? That won't happen to me. And so we see this discounting. And then afterwards, we see a form of rationalization. We documented it 30 years ago in a book called Behind Human Error, looking at failures of complex systems, right? And they rationalize it away and turn it into a small change. Well, if we just fix this component, if we just fix this subsystem, if we just fix this human being with more training, then everything's fine. We can go back to the system we were. And in both speakers so far have highlighted that change, right? That meeting challenge, the challenges we experience produces change. It changes the system. It changes the environment. The Porto Alegre in southern Brazil will not be the same in rebuilding after this event. Unfortunately, some of those changes relative to future events would have been nice to have had before an extreme weather event submerged much of the area. But it's going to stimulate more change. And so this process of how do you invest in the future when people are under pressure now? And you see this with the financial pressure, and you can see it from a variety of stakeholders who want benefits now, and they discount the risk of the future. And I think it's something both Michael and Brian have had to wrestle with in getting investments in Brian's area and in the both in your financial history, Michael, as well as in your climate resilience part of your career.
Yeah, so I think this brings up an interesting point. So we've talked about several specific disasters, and even how these disasters have changed the system, right? We talked about example of Lisbon. I know that David, you got some experience after the Columbia disaster. Michael, your role in New York City, you had a role in responding to several large tragedies. So I guess my question would be, obviously we're learning from past events, but is there a way to get ahead of the past event, right? How can we improve that resilience without having massive flooding or without having the black swan event that causes the disaster? And what are some of your thoughts about that challenge?
Things I like about resilience as opposed to preparedness planning is that it tends to be more hazard agnostic. And so, at least in the urban resilience space, we really focused on building the capacities. Resilience is a set of capacities that a system has, but in this case, a city, which is a system of systems, has in order to survive and thrive in the face of disaster. And so building those capacities is one way to get ahead of the next disaster. Because, and you referenced my time at New York City Emergency Management. In the 90s, we were very concerned about hurricanes. New York City is one of the most exposed cities to hurricanes because of the right angle between New Jersey and Long Island, and New York sitting in that, what's called the New York Bight. You get very high storm surge values for particular tracks of storms. There are scenarios where seawater is pushed 6 miles inland in Brooklyn, where there is 30 feet of storm surge at the Battery in Lower Manhattan. Like, it is an absolute catastrophe waiting to happen. Of course, on 9/11, 2 planes flew into 2 buildings. We had the crash of American 587, the anthrax attacks, the blackouts, the financial crisis of 2008. Remember, New York City was primarily a financial services town, and only in 2012 you have Superstorm Sandy, and you think about what are the capacities that got the city through all of those. They have a large, diversified budget. They're starting to do very interesting things with public space, giving people access. They had a large, flexible transportation system. They had good governance with a strong mayoral system that tied all 5 counties together. Like, all of those are kinds of capacities that allow a city to survive those disasters. And so that's at least one way. You still, if you live in New York, you need to think about storms. If you live in Mexico City, you need to think about earthquakes. If you live, in the Midwest, you need to think about tornadoes. Like, all of that's true. You still need to think about the risk science, but partly what resilience offers is this way to get ahead of the next disaster, because you start building a kind of capacity that's going to serve you in whatever the next challenge is. And I think that's really powerful.
Are you concerned at all about committing to capacity that's unnecessary? So we talk about like fragile resilience, right? Where we build capacity where it's not needed, but we don't have the capacity where we need it. And how do you make the distinction on where to build that capacity?
I mean, I think this is exactly what David was talking about with the trade-offs. Where, how can you trade off where you invest those resources, and what does that look like? One really tangible example of that, and is economic booms or bubbles provide vibrancy in an economy. A vibrant economy is absolutely essential to a resilient city or a resilient community. And yet we can fall in love with a particular sector of that economy and not promote the right diversity. And so there's that trade-off a little bit. It's like, we can't be just financial services, or in Miami, just tourism and service economy, or you think about the manufacturing centers. We need some of that diversity, but that's hard to take your foot off the gas of a sector that's doing so well. And so this is, Brian, to your point, finding where the trade-offs are and what the right allocation of resources. We're talking about it like it's centrally, controlled. Of course, it's not. We shouldn't see this as mayors doing this, or as governors or community leaders. This is the system of systems, the business leaders, the civil society, government, and all the different ways. These are things that happen, sometimes coordinated and intentional, sometimes not, that lead to more resilience or fragility in a particular community.
So I want to follow up your question, Michael's, in 2 ways. One, kind of fundamental for engineering science, and the other super practical, looking ahead, an example to think about in terms of what Michael was talking about. The first part is the fragility resilience. Now, ironically, this is almost 25 years old. I didn't quite realize it until a couple years later, when it matched some of the empirical findings. And that is that fragility or brittleness of systems, right, can't go away. It is always, there's always some degree of brittleness. We can't make it zero. And that's because of finite resources change, and as in the IT infrastructure case, others are adapting to seeking their own advantage. Also, we can't, the same constraints that require some form of resilience turn out to constrain how much resilience you can build. Because in the short run, you need to be productive and efficient and effective, right? I need to be vibrant in some areas, as Michael just went over. So these two things have to go on in balance. we talk about this based on the history of biology, borrowing from some work in the early 20th century, not simply adaptive value, but net adaptive value. Two kinds of adaptive value. One, can I be more productive and effective and efficient now, but can I be more adaptive to changing opportunities and challenges, right? We also center on new opportunities, and Michael was implying that quite strongly. Opportunity is part of building resilience. It was very conscious in Eric Holnagel and I's pivoting to a resilience orientation in the early 00s, that we wanted to see this as a way to talk about not repairing systems because they had vulnerabilities and therefore safety disasters, but to make systems more effective in the short run and the long run in a changing world, seeking opportunity. Now, this is actually a theorem. So for the systems engineers, we have a theorem that all this starts from. It's called robust yet fragile. It comes from John Doyle and Gene Carlson originally at Caltech, and I forget where Gene was at that time. And they laid out this robust yet fragile. It says formally as a theorem, right, that applies across all systems, that as you become more reliable, more competent, more effective, you will inevitably increase fragility to, right, holes in your design, holes in the way your system works, and changes in the world. So the signature of complex systems is a system that looks more and more competent, more and more reliable, but is punctuated by sudden large collapses. And that's the signature of complexity, and as scale increases, interdependencies increase. Now, we've built up a body of fundamental knowledge that goes further. That's not the only theorem. We have more theorems now. We have some laws, and we're starting to tie these together in terms of some fundamentals. From John Doyle has a theory with colleagues that illustrates some of the sort of meta-architectural principles. And these can be applied to things as diverse as the internet survivability in the face of the kinds of challenges. It isn't just your habitability that changes. These kinds of challenge events could combine in ways that degrade the internet and related internet-dependent services. Well, that would be a large-scale societal level catastrophe or regional level catastrophe, depending on how that plays out. So that was just a topic of investigation trying to look ahead. So we have some real theoretical foundations, and I mean theoretical in the really good sense. Like, we don't like building planes without understanding the theory of behind aeronautics, right? We don't want to go back to the 1919s and flying biplanes or something with baling wire and chewing gum, or whatever the saying goes. So there's real scientific fundamentals we can draw on to inspire a new kind of engineering, because it's not just engineering. If the internet, we might talk about it in one area, or Brian was talking about it in classic reliability engineering, but now we're talking about it at new scales. And so there's a lot we could say about that, but let's pivot to another practical example. Let me throw a thought experiment at you. What Michael just laid out, let's imagine that for the food supply network. Think about the food supply network and the vulnerability across, right, its natural evolution, the natural inequalities. We have food deserts in certain areas. We have food supply is a distributed system in space. It's distributed over multiple organizations, right? It's right. And Eleanor Ostrom, in her Nobel Prize winning work in 2009, would call this very highly polycentric, many centers of partial control of different pieces across space, time, and function. And now you have a combination of infrastructure breakdowns, extreme weather events or weather seasons disrupting food production. You have other things, the same natural environmental effects may affect transportation systems. You may have acute external events that, as in Port Alegre, don't have to be at that scale, that could still block some forms of transportation. Oh, Baltimore Harbor just happened. Right? You start putting these things together and say, how could we make the food supply system more resilient? This is a problem we tried to anticipate and think through. How could we coordinate all these different organizations across the different societal scales in order to actively adapt effectively to handle an emerging food supply problem, right? And many people are suggesting that food supply could be a crisis of coming decades. Right? How would we anticipate and build a mechanism so that we could adapt when the details of the future challenge we can't know? But the general outline of the challenge, we can understand many things about. And how do you prepare it in advance? Because our old rule is if you rely on adaptability that starts in the middle of the crisis, that's not very likely to work. Right? We don't want Captain Sully's, right? In the sense of we have to rely on some source of heroic or large forms of expertise, important forms of expertise to solve the problem when you're in the middle of it. We want capabilities that are set up to come into action and help you handle that crisis, even when the details of it are unknowable in advance.
So let's talk about that with the details being unknowable, right? As a fundamental problem, right? This fuzzy future. In fact, even Sarah shared in the chat talks about we don't even know the life cycle, the length of the life cycle of a lot of these systems, right? We may think that it's going to be in place for 20 years, but it may end up being 30, 40 longer for some systems. And so my question would be then, let's think about one of our primary tools is modeling and simulation, right? And Brian, I'm going to direct this question to you with the MBSE in your title. How can we still use these tools even in an environment where we don't know the details of the specific future threats, or we don't know some of the details about the life cycle itself?
Yeah, gosh, predicting the future, gee.
Yeah. So easy question.
Well, yeah. So Dassault's got the crystal ball application that I'm sorry, it's still in R&D. No. Hey, look, predicting the future, yeah, gosh, that's tough, right? I'm not sure if I can sit back and say that, okay, this is exactly how we're going to, how we can actually trot out the course. I'll say a general trend that I'm kind of seeing, and I'm happy to look at the chat here, and I happen to see there's a question kind of regarding how AI works in this too. So I'm going to try to see if I can fold all those together. Is that one, we have to recognize that there's a lot of stuff that like we've already said a few times, right? Things change. We have to basically adapt. Well, to adapt, it means that you have to understand a few things. One is going to be, how do I collect data so that I can essentially learn, right? So we're building systems now that, and of course, there's so much digital dust out there these days that we're building systems that can collect the data. Question is, can we put them together, or can we at least have some sort of wisdom in terms of what's the future analytics that we might want to have? What's the data that we're going to say that we wish that we don't have now, that we wish we'll have in, let's say, 5 years, if we think that's kind of the horizon that we want to plan against, so that when we're 3 years out, we are smart enough to basically say, okay, here's the way that we think things are going. When you're looking for patterns like that, there's certainly, the ability to find patterns using machine learning and AI. It's almost scary. In what can be extracted out there, and again, because I also work a lot on the adversarial side, it's scary two ways, right? Because there's one where you can have your adversary basically applying AI against you, at which point now you're in a position where you have to say, okay, well, how do I actually defend against an AI? Especially if I'm collecting all this data, right? So it's we're talking about balances before. I'm not answering your question because I don't know how to predict the future. It's just really going to be more of a trying to recognize. I'll go back to the man always beats the machine, right? We work off of knowledge and we work off of creativity. We work off of the whole data, information, knowledge, wisdom sort of pyramid. It's just build up the systems that help you build up a lot more of that D to get you a lot more of that I to ultimately get up to that knowledge, and then try to build up the wisdom.
I think we would all agree that models to predict the future are not a wise use of your time, right? Generally speaking, right? We paint with a very broad brush, right? We're not going to be able to predict what's the exact fault that's going to occur in New York City in 30 years, right? My question was more, and I think you got to this, so we can still use models to help us get insights into our interventions, or into some ways we can increase resilience.
And let me switch away from the model if I can,
to
more of how we manage the project. So through the bulk of my career, when I'm going through my systems engineering process, I basically am carrying a point design, maybe 2 or 3 variants, through the life cycle, through the classical V. And which the basic idea was, let me get to what I think is the best answer. Again, we're predicting the future, right? Let me get to what I think is the best answer, and then as I learn, as I go through the review process and the development process, and I make changes, and then my baselines kind of evolve and the like. With our ability to, I'll say, collect and manage data, just kind of with what's out there now, I can do more of a transition towards set-based design, kind of concepts. So instead of just designing one point design and bringing it through the life cycle and having the various reviews, I can have a whole cloud of designs. And when I'm looking at the whole cloud of designs, and imagine this in 2D, of course, this is going to be hyperdimensional, but like if I'm looking at a 2D map of, let's say, 2 parameters that are really important to me, I can see there's a whole lot of green dots. A green dot meaning that this combination satisfies the requirements. I could see where the big clouds are, right? And I can see where the outliers are, and I can see where the where the wave fronts are, the Pareto fronts, which don't work. And I can keep moving, or I can kind of adapt my design more towards the middle of those clouds. And then at the same time, I can design to start sensing kind of around the Pareto front, which is, of course, the edge of uncertainty, because, of course, that's going to be where I learn things. And so with this transition to, I'll say, set-based design, where I'm still applying models, the same models as before. I'm just doing a lot more of them because I can, right? And because I have, the SPDM part of my title here, the simulation process data management, because I am now handling simulation data like parts themselves, I can actually then begin to build up, I'll say, something of a strategy, at least try to have a better understanding of what's this landscape that my system needs to essentially negotiate, and how do I get myself smarter in that landscape? How can I even, let's say, find patterns using AI, because I have the option to have literally millions of designs working their way through the design process simultaneously.
So I want to answer Brian's question by saying, engineers, the answer is humility.
Absolutely.
And I want to preface that by saying, when you take a resilient stance, you are recognizing that you are up to your neck in the potential of challenges to undermine services you value that give meaning and allow your life to proceed. You are in this. I am in this. We are all in this. We are not outside as scientists and engineers saying, oh, look at that phenomenon. Look what those people should do. It's what we should do. And so the phenomena of adaptation and the phenomena of maladaptation, like I mentioned, discounting and rationalizing as barriers to learning, and we understand something about those processes that people, including us, including engineering. And so the humility says, our models will be wrong.
Yes, absolutely.
No matter how good they have been to help us build better systems. John Doyle and Gene Carlson's finding 24 years ago as a theorem, a proven theorem, says this is the way this world works, right? We will produce success through modeling, through new computational mechanisms. A variety of things will allow us to grow. But that growth will produce complexity penalties. It will increase scale, will increase interdependencies. It will make harder to model and track those interdependencies. What it means, and we have theorems on this now, is your model, by being successful just now, will produce change that will break your model. It will be broken in the future. You can guarantee it. This is now a new constraint. It's called extensibility, graceful extensibility. That's right. Viability of your system in the long run. What we were talking about, particularly Michael, about the 100 cities initiative and other things, is what's the viability of these urban areas over the long span? You asked the long span question earlier. Viability is a long-term constraint on effective systems. Viability requires extensibility, because in the not that long run, new kinds of challenge events will occur that will strike the boundaries, will will reveal the brittleness in what had been successful, because brittleness can't be zero. Extensibility can't be infinite. Why? Because in the short run, it will cost too much in resources. So the science of moving to resilience as extensibility at the different scales is about, it's a challenge to us to say, as you asked it earlier, which investments will build adaptive capacity in a future-oriented world that is likely to be effective when we face challenges which we can't describe and anticipate in detail. And so we know something about how to build this kind of extensibility. And we have physical models. Eleanor Ostrom tells us about it in her social science work. Al Roth in his Nobel Prize tells us about it in matching markets and microeconomics. Studies we've done of how people adapt to cope with complexity and operating high-risk systems tell us something about extensibility. So we have the basis, but engineering has to change. Dave Alderson and I wrote a paper reviewing 15 years of attempts to progress in modeling and simulation for resilient infrastructures, energy, all the lifeline infrastructures. And our review came back and said, we're moving slow, we're too slow and stale. We keep thinking once we have the right model and have a more expansive model that delineates all the different interactions across all the different lifeline infrastructures, we will now know how to predict and make wise investment choices so that the problem of New York or New Orleans or Houston or whatever will be solved. And we went through it all and said, we're making a little bit of progress. And then we charted the needs, the societal needs that Michael talked about and that you opened up with. And we went, we're not keeping pace. What's one of the basic ways adaptive systems fail? They can't keep pace with growing challenges. Well, we, can't keep pace with the changing needs and the environmental changes that challenge that can disrupt those societal needs, they're growing faster than we're moving. So this is a lesson for all of us. If we want to be resilient, it's not those people be resilient. We need to be resilient. That means we need to be willing to revise how we approach these problems. And to do that, to cooperate in new ways. And we're not always enabled or anxious to cooperate and work together in new ways. That's one of Michael's big challenges, was to get people to work together and align despite their individual interests, their individual perspectives, to align those to a degree to take a future-oriented view that would be constructive.
Yeah, David, I'm glad you brought it there, because I have an example that might tie all this together in a real world way. And I do think that integrated action, interdisciplinary thinking is one of the big challenges of resilience. And partly, to go back to your question about the food supply system, the food system, let's take supply out of it for a second. It's the food system more generally. You're right, there might be a crisis in the food system, but there is also a health crisis. And there's also a biodiversity crisis. And so one way that you can better leverage the investment in the food system is to think about these other challenges too, biodiversity and health, in ways that do more with that investment to build adaptive capacity across a couple of different frontiers. And we've been calling this the resilience dividend. You do it for one reason, improve the reliability of the food system, but you get these other dividends, better health outcomes, better biodiversity outcomes, better climate, better resilience to climate hazards, because you reduce, heat, or, your rooftop gardens, provide food for neighborhoods, they reduce heat, they increase community cohesion, they do all these things. Those are all dividends to a particular investment that might have been made particularly in the food supply system, but has all these other benefits. So that's what the chief resilience officers that we put into the 100 resilient cities we're trying to do, is to be able to think about work across those different sectors and silos and tie that investment together in meaningful ways that ended up building adaptive capacity and resilience. It's hard. And at a university, this is my first stint in academia, and I can see the silos, across the schools and colleges pretty well formed. And it's starting to break down a little bit, I think, in part because the research funders like NSF and NOAA and those folks are requiring some more interdisciplinary proposals. But you can still see it, and you see it particularly in the educational side, where the education comes through the schools and colleges, and by God, we're going to train engineers or architects or biologists in particular ways, and then we see that out there in the real world. So finding that commonality across those different, I think, and discovering that resilience dividend is definitely one of the ways that we can change the system.
So you pointed out that one of the places that needs to change is their education, because how do you actually cross-train people and build that in from an early stage of educational process? I mean, one of the interesting observations when I started teaching resilience engineering in 2008 is the most effective students in the class, not the most knowledgeable, but the most effective, were the youngest. Why? And I think part of it was they were the most open. They hadn't been in a discipline, they hadn't been specialized enough. And they also were, if they got into the class, there's a little self-selection going on. They were already oriented towards their world is going to change, and they need to have knowledge and skills to deal with a changing and more challenging world. It's different than what had gone on before. So they were already open to learn, but question the traditional disciplinary pathways. And, the older people had more specific knowledge, but it was the younger ones who helped make the older ones' knowledge useful and bring it into seeing the problems from a much larger perspective. And I think it's held up till when we just taught it again last semester. I guess it's still this, I guess our semester ended. So this semester, it's still often the youngest ones who are fabulous drivers, because you have to integrate across different perspectives. Now, what's interesting? That's one of the theorems. You talked about it, Michael, and a bunch of empirical observations and experience. It's a theorem, right? The view from any single perspective simultaneously hides and reveals, right? There is no single omniscient perspective. Right. And we can show this in biology, we can show it in neurophysiology, we can show it in a lot of different ways. In fact, it's a theorem we can prove, right? That it takes the integration across multiple perspectives in order to, you have to shift and contrast perspectives to see more than what you can see from any single one. That's part of what Brian was doing with the modeling and the change in the form and targets of the modeling. He was changing and integrating across different perspectives relative to traditional approaches. It's what the interdisciplinary research projects try to do. Now, our problem, like with the food problem, was how do you get, despite NSF and others' willingness to fund interdisciplinary projects, how do you build projects with industry? Right? You crossed it in one way, I crossed it in the other direction for my whole 45 years. It's difficult, and you normally don't get rewarded. That's the silo, right? Yes, you get rewarded in a certain way when we all need to shift and tackle bigger problems at new scales with more partners. Yeah. So we need to change in how we do our R&D if we're going to make resilient societies.
And David, I'll just very quickly point out that in the real world, there's a short-term efficiency trade-off with interdisciplinary work.
Oh, yeah.
It's just like more efficient for particular engineers to talk to other particular engineers about a particular engineering problem. I mean, that's like every time we do a interdisciplinary actual design, I've seen it all over the world in different contexts. People are always annoyed that they're coming to talk about something they don't care about for a little while. And then they get on board and start to say, oh yeah, we designed these great what they called the urban oasis schoolyards in Paris, where there were like green features, and we opened them to the city opened them to the communities, and there was an immigrant angle and all this stuff. And at first it was like, get all those immigration, climate, school construction authority, budget people in the same room. They just did not want to be there. But it took a little bit of building, and now it's like one of these programs that Paris trots out as a great success. But initially it thought it felt inefficient.
So one question I asked, so we're coming up to our last kind of almost 9 minutes here. So we've got a good group of system engineers, or those who are at least connected with Nkosi here, joining us today. And so they've heard you talk about how important it is to increase resilience, how challenging it is. And my question would be, and we've kind of danced around this a little bit, but what can these individuals do, right? So you're someone who cares enough about resilience to spend an hour on a Wednesday, learning about it. What is kind of your call to action, or what ways can our community make a difference? Any advice you have there, or thoughts? Maybe it's just a very, very challenging question, or very challenging problem. So Brian, from your perspective, as someone who's involved in kind of the MBSE community, what are some things that you can do to develop yourself to be ready to contribute to resilience engineering? Maybe is another way to phrase this.
Yeah, see, and I guess I'm coming also from the my head kind of goes to the pragmatic. It's like, okay, what's the contract going to allow me to do? Right. And I think it's going to change a lot on I'll say, the client, that you're dealing with, so I think that's what makes this kind of difficult for me to answer. I've had, I have several customers, all my customers are systems engineers, right? Because I sell systems engineering tools now, right? I have some that are able to get this really big, broad perspective, right? They're trying to build up these digital cities, that are trying to understand, okay, how do I find or even identify the different stakeholders, like what Michael was just kind of talking about, so that, how they play together. And hey, that's great. I think they're kind of primed, and maybe those who are working with large cities are primed, to think more about resilience, because, cities are things that last a long time. Or they need to last a long time, even though they may change, right, through time. When I'm dealing with a engineer who's working on, let's say, the high-tech industry where they're building cell phones, right? The cell phone, there the interest seems to be less about, or I'll say the resilience is going to be more of the, can it be secure and trustworthy and robust enough and survive long enough, that someone's ready to then discard it and buy the next one, right? So they're looking at 3 years, if that, kind of thing, versus like, when do I get ready to stop support? So I'm not answering your question here because I'm not sure that I really know how to answer it. It just feels like there's so much is driven by context. So right. I think it's going to be more of a, hey, the individual, recognize your context, recognize how resiliency, I guess, maybe plays within your context.
So we actually really do have a lot to offer. Yeah. It's just different. And people are not, this is back to, we just talked about the reluctance to do things differently in a period that demands every role at every layer of society to think a little differently. And same applies in systems engineering, right? And so we can run through a variety of things. We have laws, we have proven theorems, right? We have fundamentals that tell us how some of these things work, all of which lead to very pragmatic things you can do, but they're different. So it's simple, it's hard to give a quick example in a minute, but let me give you one. There's a thing called the fluency law. Well-adapted activity hides the difficulties handled and the dilemmas resolved. So other perspectives don't see what's hard, and they don't see the dilemmas, right? Which have no absolute solution, no absolute best solution. And so they miss the sources of resilience. They miss how people adapt now to make systems work. So the fluency law leads us to a practical guide. It first emerged in 2004, but really a finding goes back another 20 years. In English, we finally figured out how to say it because the original finding was in French. another problem. But anyway, it's called the difference between work as imagined and work as done. And it turns out that that gap has to be there. It will be there no matter what. Different parties at different levels of an organization or a sector will misunderstand what goes on at other parts of that sector. And so what you invest in is closing the gap between work or activity as imagined versus activity as done. Fundamental practical principle. Well, guess where we ended up starting this? In our industry university cooperation with critical digital infrastructure. They started to build from a local one-by-one learning process to a much more system-wide learning process. It's triggered a group called Learning from Incidents. But what's an incident is now different. An incident isn't an outage like the one that happened this week in Australia with Google Cloud and a financial house managing $80 billion, including lots of pensions. And there was an outage of the system linked to Google Cloud, which everybody depends on. So what Learning from Incidents does is not worry about that case. There's already mechanisms to try to learn and to mislearn from cases like that. What we're looking at is noticing the small cases where adaptation occurs successfully. Right? That's one of the keys when we started resilience engineering in the early 00s. The first thing is stop looking at the failures and start looking at why failure usually doesn't happen. The line is, our systems are more brittle than we realize, but fail less often because of hidden sources of resilience. Now, those hidden sources of resilience turn out not to be powerful enough to handle everything. That's sort of what came out from the earlier discussion on urban resilience. But they're there. Resilience is, when we look at biology and draw from that and bring it into the human ecological, social ecological, or human technological worlds, there is sources of resilience. They're already there. They have to be. Remember that rule, right? Viability requires extensibility. Resilience as extensibility is already in your system. Maybe not in the right place, maybe not in the right way, given what's going to happen. So we have practical tools. That's one. And it's an orientation we can develop in different worlds. It's, the issue is, are you ready to change? Are you ready to revise? Right? Because you need to build systems that are more responsive to challenge and opportunity. I want to end us on the note that this isn't just about handling bad things happening. This is about actually thriving in the context of change by seeing opportunity and pursuing that in ways that balance the different constraints and the different goals, because generally our societies are working at new and bigger scales, crossing more scales, more layers of society. So if we can see opportunities that do the resilience dividend that Michael pointed out, that's a huge message for everybody, all of the different stakeholders. Pursuing that can provide you so much. Now, as engineers, I'm going to close with one thing. If you want to know how to do this, we showed you with equations in papers on how to do this on a particular brittleness problem with pilots and automation. Right? That's actually caused accidents and incidents, actually killed a few people. And we can show you how to redesign your controllers with some of these fundamental resilience findings in mind. And you can actually redesign the equations. And we beat all the classics. Now, that's a really fine-grained example versus the big societal urban scale things we're talking about. But yes, we have pragmatics if you're willing to think different.
Yeah, what a great couple things about perspective, about being willing to change. Michael, we're on our last minute here, so I'll give you the last 30 seconds. If you have any call to actions or anything you want to add, give you a chance.
No, that's a pretty good way to end. I do think there was a comment here in the chat from Derek Carpenter that was talking about this. Now these are my words, but this tension between the generalists and the specialists, who both have real important roles to play. And so I think at the highest level, like being conscious of that pretty good and creative tension is one really practical thing that as you go through navigate your own work, you could keep your mind on.
Fantastic. Well, I want to re-thank each of you for joining us today, for calling all systems. This has been a really enjoyable conversation, both for myself and I'm sure for our audience as well. For all of us, everyone who joined us live, thank you for joining us. Some resources from all three of these panelists will become available for those of you who registered for the panel. A recording will also be coming out, and then we also hope to see many of you at the International Symposium in July. So thank you so much, and everyone have a great day or evening.